What would you do if the most feared man in the city could have any woman alive, turned every flawless supermodel away like they were nothing, and instead fell helplessly, dangerously in love with the one soft, clumsy woman the whole world had agreed to overlook? They lined up for him, women carved straight from magazine covers, women who had never once been told to make themselves smaller. He looked through every single one of them as if they were glass. And then a plump, flustered nanny spilled a tray of warm milk across his imported marble, apologized to the floor instead of to his face, and without ever meaning to, stole the coldest heart in the city. This is a story of hidden worth, unexpected love, and the terrifying devotion of a ruthless man who finally decided to see. Nora Bennett had spent 29 years learning how to disappear. She was a soft, generously curved woman with a round face, thick arms, and a warm heart that the world had never once rewarded her for. She wore oversized cardigans the color of dust, kept her eyes low, and moved through hallways as though apologizing for the space her body occupied. She was clumsy in the way that gentle, anxious people often are, forever knocking over cups and tripping over her own feet, forever whispering sorry to furniture. But beneath the fumbling exterior lived a rare and stubborn kindness. She remembered how everyone took their coffee. She noticed when a stranger was about to cry. She had raised 3 younger siblings on nothing but love and grit, and she poured that same fierce tenderness into every child ever placed in her care. Nobody saw it. To the glittering people who hired and dismissed her, she was furniture, a background nanny, a punchline in sensible shoes. She had been told 100 times that she was too much and not enough all at once, and she had almost begun to believe it. On the morning everything changed, she climbed the endless marble steps of a fortress-like estate, clutching a battered resume folder to her chest like a shield, sweating through her best blouse in the summer heat. She was interviewing to care for a grieving little boy in a house where the last 6 nannies had fled in tears. She did not know the man who owned it. She did not know that the moment she stepped through those towering doors, the loneliest predator in the city would look up from his cold, ordered life and feel something long frozen crack open inside his chest. She only knew that she needed the job, that her hands were shaking, and that she had exactly one chance not to ruin it. The doors opened. The cool air smelled of cedar and money and something darker underneath. And Nora, true to form, took 2 steps inside, caught her heel on the edge of a rug, and sent her folder scattering across a floor worth more than her entire life. Her heart plummeted. She had no idea she had just walked into her own rescue. The man who descended the sweeping staircase moved like weather, like something the room rearranged itself to accommodate. He was tall and broad and dressed in a charcoal suit cut so precisely it seemed carved onto him, and he carried a stillness so absolute that grown men had been known to sweat under it. His name was Raphael Moretti, and in the shadowed corners of the city he was spoken of the way people speak of storms, with respect and lowered voices. He was the head of a syndicate that reached into every port and every powerful pocket for 100 miles, a man who could end a rival with a single unhurried nod. He rarely raised his voice. He never needed to. Beautiful women orbited him constantly, elegant socialites in silk and imported supermodels with cheekbones like knives, all of them competing for a flicker of his attention, all of them met with the same detached boredom. He was surrounded, and he was profoundly, bone-deep alone. His wife had died 2 years earlier in a violence meant for him, and since that day his young son had not spoken a single word. The boy, Matteo, drifted through the vast house like a small ghost, refusing food, refusing play, staring through the world as if it had nothing left to offer him. Raphael had buried his grief beneath ledgers and loaded weapons, and he had stopped expecting anything soft to ever reach him again. Then he came down his own staircase and found a plump, flustered woman on her hands and knees on his priceless marble, scrambling to gather scattered papers, whispering frantic apologies, her cheeks flushed crimson with shame. Everyone else in his life performed for him. This woman was simply, helplessly real. Before he could speak, a small shadow slipped out from behind his legs. Matteo. The boy crept toward the mess and stopped, staring at a single bright crayon that had rolled loose from the folder. Nora, forgetting entirely to be afraid, looked up at the child and smiled the softest smile Raphael had ever seen. That is my favorite color, she said gently. Warm sun orange. It makes the best skies when you draw. The boy's gaze lifted slowly to her round, kind face, then to the crayon. And then, impossibly, the corners of his mouth twitched upward. It was small. It was fragile. But it was the first flicker of feeling the child had shown in 2 silent years, and Raphael felt his frozen heart lurch violently in his chest. He stared at the clumsy woman who had ruined his floor and, in the same careless breath, cracked open his son. "Get up," he said, and his voice was not cruel. "You have the job, Miss Bennet. Do not make me regret it." 3 weeks bled into the marble halls of the Moretti estate, and something in that fortress of silence began, quietly, to thaw. Nora was a chaotic, luminous disruption to a house built on order and menace. She possessed almost no grace at all. In her first days alone, she set off the security alarm attempting to make toast, knocked a 200-year-old vase into a curtain, and tipped an entire bowl of flour across a set of custom Italian shoes while baking cookies with Matteo. And yet Raphael, who had spent his life surrounded by people who lied to his face and women who calculated his worth before they learned his name, found himself utterly, dangerously captivated. Nora had nothing. She wore every feeling openly on her flushed face, and she poured her whole warm soul into caring for his son. Under her clumsy, patient devotion, the boy began to return to the world. Matteo ate again. He laughed, a startled, rusty sound, at her tumbles and her terrible jokes. He clung to her soft waist whenever the dark pressed close, and slowly, day by day, the ghost became a child again. Raphael caught himself rushing home from meetings that once consumed him, sitting in the shadows of his study just to watch the security feeds of the kitchen, not scanning for threats, but watching the way she hummed while she cooked, the way her thick fingers gentled the boy's hair. He was mesmerized by the sheer, unguarded softness of her in a life made entirely of hard edges. But the world beyond those iron gates was neither soft nor safe. The estate hosted a lavish charity gala that week, a glittering event where the city's wealth and its underworld mingled beneath crystal light, and Nora, terrified and out of place, was sent down to make an appearance on the family's behalf. She wore the one nice dress she owned, deep green and a little too tight, and she prayed to vanish into the walls. She did not. A woman intercepted her near the champagne, a supermodel named Vivian whose skeletal elegance was matched only by her cruelty, a woman who had spent months trying and failing to make herself the future Mrs. Moretti. Vivian looked Nora slowly up and down, her glossed lips curling. "I think you're lost, sweetheart," she said, loud enough for heads to turn. "The catering entrance is in the back. Or did you already eat everything on the carts?" Laughter rippled through the beautiful crowd. Nora felt the old, familiar shame flood her cheeks, felt herself begin to shrink, to fold inward, to apologize for existing. And then the entire ballroom went silent, because Raphael Moretti was walking toward them, and his eyes were black with a promise of ruin. He did not glance at the supermodel. He did not glance at the whispering crowd. He crossed the marble with unhurried, terrifying grace and stopped directly in front of Nora, close enough that she could smell cedar and danger, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. The crowd held its breath. Vivian recovered first, sliding in with a radiant, desperate smile, reaching for his arm. "Raphael, darling," she purred, "I was just dealing with a bit of a pest. Security really should do a better job at the door." He did not so much as acknowledge her hand on his sleeve. He simply kept his eyes on Nora, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Then he turned, and when he spoke, his voice was soft, silken, and absolutely lethal. "You seem to be under the mistaken impression, Vivian, that you decide who belongs in my presence." The supermodel's smile shattered like dropped crystal. "Miss Bennet is the most important person in my home," Raphael continued, his gaze sweeping the frozen guests. "She takes up exactly as much room as I want her to, which is all of it. And if anyone in this city ever speaks to her again the way you just did, they will not simply be escorted out. They will disappear." The threat was not decoration. It was a promise, and everyone in that ballroom understood it. Vivian backed away, her heels stuttering on the marble, tears of pure humiliation streaking her mascara before she fled entirely. The crowd found sudden fascination with their shoes, their drinks, the ceiling, anything but the eyes of the man who owned the room. Raphael turned back to Nora, whose heart was hammering so hard she could barely breathe. He reached out, slowly, and with a tenderness that seemed impossible for such dangerous hands, he tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "You do not hide anymore, Piccola," he murmured, low enough that only she could hear it. "Not in this house, and never in front of me." But even as the warmth of that moment bloomed in her chest, a colder current moved beneath the surface of the party. Across the ballroom, one of Raphael's most trusted men watched the exchange with a smile that never reached his eyes and quietly slid a phone from his jacket. Nora did not see him. Raphael did not see him. But a plan far older and far uglier than a supermodel's spite had just begun to move, and the soft, clumsy nanny they had all underestimated was standing squarely in its path. The man watching from the shadows was Salvatore, Raphael's underboss, a snake in a beautiful suit who had smiled at his boss's face for a decade while dreaming of his chair. Salvatore had been quietly bleeding the family for months, skimming from shipments, forging manifests, feeding scraps of Moretti territory to a rival faction hungry to move in. He had believed himself untouchable, invisible, protected by Raphael's own trust. But Salvatore had made one fatal miscalculation. He had assumed that the fat little nanny drifting around the estate was exactly what everyone else believed her to be, a harmless nobody, blind to the machinery of the dangerous house she lived in. He was wrong. Nora noticed things. She always had. A lifetime of being overlooked had made her a quiet, patient observer of the people who ignored her, and she read a room the way other people read a book. She noticed that Salvatore's smile tightened whenever Raphael's back was turned. She noticed the way certain deliveries arrived at odd hours, logged by men who avoided her eyes. And on a rain-lashed evening, tidying the study Raphael had absent-mindedly left unlocked, she noticed a shipping ledger open on the desk, its neat columns humming with a wrongness she could not name and could not ignore. Nora had spent years keeping the accounts for a chaotic household on almost no money, stretching every cent until it screamed, and numbers that did not add up made her skin prickle. 3 shipments logged as arriving at the southern docks had timestamps that overlapped impossibly with vessels she had heard the men say were still far out at sea. Someone was inventing arrivals to move money through gaps that were never supposed to exist. She did not understand the whole of it. She understood enough to be frightened. Later that night, unable to sleep, she padded down to the vast industrial kitchen for the only cure she knew, a midnight snack and a moment of quiet. She wrapped herself in her fluffy robe, pulled a plate of leftovers from the enormous refrigerator, and, being herself, immediately caught her elbow on a carton and sent milk splashing across the tile. She was crouched with a fistful of paper towels, muttering at her own clumsiness, when she heard the back door click. She did not turn. She did not hear the soft, calculated footsteps of the man in dark clothing who had slipped past the outer guards and now crept toward the woman who knew too much. Salvatore had realized she had seen the ledger. He had come to make certain she never spoke of it. He raised a hand toward her back. And then Nora, reaching for a stray splash of milk, pivoted sharply on the slick tile, and her feet flew out from under her entirely. All of her went down hard and fast, tumbling backward with the unstoppable momentum of a falling wall, straight into the man behind her. Her full weight slammed into his chest, driving every ounce of breath from his lungs, hurling him off balance. His boots scrambled, found no purchase on the wet floor, and he went crashing backward, the back of his skull cracking against the sharp granite edge of the island with a sickening sound. He crumpled, motionless, a small silenced pistol skidding out of his slack hand and spinning away beneath the stove. Nora landed hard on the tile, groaning, surrounded by spilled milk and her own bewilderment. It took her several seconds to notice the man sprawled beside her, dressed all in dark clothing, utterly unconscious, and the gun glinting beneath the appliance. Her mind refused to make sense of it. Then the kitchen doors burst open and Raphael was there, an alarm having pulled him from his study, a weapon in his hand and murder on his face, braced for a slaughter. Instead, he found his ruthless underboss knocked cold on the floor and his soft, clumsy nanny sitting in a puddle of milk, looking profoundly apologetic. "I am so sorry," she whispered, tears pricking her eyes. "I dropped the milk and I slipped and I think I fell on somebody." Please do not fire me. Raphael let out a sound that was half gasp and half something he had not felt in years, disbelief tipping into a raw, cracked laugh. He set his weapon down and crossed the room, and instead of shouting, he knelt in the spilled milk in his $1,000 trousers and took her trembling, sticky hands in both of his. You did not just fall, Piccola, he said, his dark eyes burning with an intensity that stole her breath. You just stopped a man I trusted from putting a bullet in your back. And in doing so, you handed me the traitor who has been trying to gut my family for months. His thumb brushed a smear of milk from her cheek, his touch shockingly reverent for hands that had done terrible things. She stared at him, still shaking, milk soaking through her robe, and understood dimly that her whole small life had just shifted onto some vast and dangerous axis. But this, it turned out, was only the beginning. Because Salvatore had not been working alone, and the rival faction he had been feeding was not the kind to abandon a plan simply because their inside man had failed. They wanted Moretti territory, and now they wanted something else too, the soft, curvy woman the great Raphael Moretti had so foolishly, so publicly, allowed himself to love. In the days that followed, Raphael did not let Nora out of his sight. He installed her and Matteo in the most secure wing of the estate, doubled the guards, and questioned Salvatore in rooms Nora was wise enough never to ask about. But he did something else, too, something that frightened her far more than the danger. He began to look at her not as staff, not as a rescue he had made, but as a woman, as an equal, as someone he could not imagine his cold life without. He learned that beneath her fumbling exterior lived a mind that never stopped noticing, and he began to bring her his troubles, spreading ledgers across the kitchen table late at night while they ate takeout on the floor, listening to her quiet, careful observations about which numbers lied and which men could not be trusted. She caught patterns his own accountants had missed. She flagged a courier whose loyalty had quietly been bought. She was, he realized with a kind of awe, the most valuable person in his entire organization, and she had been standing in plain sight the whole time, wrapped in a dust-colored cardigan, apologizing to the floor. But the rival faction was closing in, and their leader, a cold and patient man named Castellano, was not interested in a slow game. He had lost his inside man, but he still knew the estate's weaknesses, and he still believed that the surest way to break a king was to threaten what the king loved. On a night thick with fog rolling in off the water, when Raphael had been drawn away to a false emergency at the docks, Castellano's men moved on the house. They cut the power. They slipped past the outer perimeter using code Salvatore had sold them weeks before. And upstairs, in the nursery, Nora was reading a bedtime story to a sleepy Matteo when the lights died and the house went utterly, terrifyingly black. She did not scream. Somewhere in the dark below she heard a soft, wrong sound, a muffled thud, a body falling, and every nerve in her body understood. They had drawn Raphael away on purpose. They had come while he was gone, and they had come for the child and for her. But the men creeping up the grand staircase in the dark had made the same mistake every cruel person in Nora's life had ever made. They had looked at her soft body and her nervous hands and decided she was helpless. In that black, silent house, Nora Bennett became something none of them expected. She scooped Matteo into her arms, pressed a finger to his lips, and moved. She knew this house. She had spent weeks cleaning every corner of it while everyone looked straight through her, and she knew things the intruder's stolen blueprints could never tell them. The loose panel in the linen closet, the narrow servant's passage behind the nursery wall, the heavy old safe room door Raphael had shown her only once. She carried the boy into the dark passage as heavy boots thundered down the hall they had just left, and she did not let herself panic, because panic was a luxury, and this child was not. Find the woman and the boy, a rough voice snarled somewhere close. Castellano wants them alive. Nora's blood ran cold, but her hands stayed steady. She reached the reinforced door of the safe room, pressed the boy inside, and did the hardest thing she had ever done. She did not follow him in, because if she sealed herself away, the men would tear the house apart until they found the door, and they would breach it, and Matteo would have nowhere left to run. So she kissed the child's forehead, whispered that she would be right back, sealed him safely behind the steel, and turned to face the dark alone, drawing them away from the only thing that mattered. She fumbled through the black kitchen, found the heavy iron skillet she had scorched 100 dinners in, and pressed herself flat against the wall beside the doorway, her heart a frantic drum, her whole soft body trembling. A beam of light swept the room. A man stepped through, gun first, muttering into a radio that the safe room was sealed and the brat was locked inside. He never saw her. As he passed, Nora swung the skillet upward with every ounce of the strength her large, sturdy frame possessed, and the iron connected with the side of his knee with a crunch that dropped him screaming to the tile, his weapon clattering into the dark. She did not stop. She had spent her life being knocked down, and she had learned exactly how to use her weight when it counted. She shoved the falling man hard into the second intruder crowding through the doorway, and both went down in a tangle of limbs and cursing. Then the front gates below exploded inward with the tortured shriek of an engine pushed past its limit, and she knew that Raphael had realized the emergency was a lie and had come home. Gunfire erupted below, brief and brutal and final. Nora huddled against the wall, iron skillet raised, listening to the storm of it, and then to the terrible silence that followed. And then the kitchen doors were kicked from their hinges, and Raphael filled the doorway, soaked in rain, his suit ruined, his eyes wild and searching, a man who had driven through his own gates to reach her. Nora, he roared, and there was raw terror in it, a fear she had never once heard from the coldest man in the city. Here, she gasped, stepping out of the shadows on shaking legs, dropping the skillet with a clang. Mateo is safe. He is in the safe room. I led them away from him. For a moment Raphael simply stared at her disheveled hair and her soaked robe, and the two groaning men on the floor, and the terrifying, luminous courage shining out of her. And then he crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her hard against his chest. His hands moved frantically over her arms, her face, her waist, checking for blood, for wounds, for any sign that the world had hurt what was his. Are you hurt? He demanded, his breathing ragged, his voice cracking against her hair. Did they touch you? Look at me. Tell me. I am all right. She wept, finally letting the terror crash over her, her fingers twisting in the ruined wool of his jacket. I am all right. I could not let them near him, Raphael. I could not. He pulled back just far enough to frame her round, tear-streaked face in his large, trembling hands, and he looked at her the way no one in her whole overlooked life had ever looked at her, as though she were the most precious and formidable thing ever made. You are magnificent, he breathed. You faced armed men in the dark to protect my son, with nothing but a skillet and the biggest heart I have ever known. Do you understand what you are? You are not staff, Nora. You are not a nanny I hired. You are the bravest, kindest, most beautiful woman I have ever met, and I am never, ever letting you go. In the hall his men were dragging the intruders away, and his loyal Lieutenant Enzo appeared in the doorway, breathless, to report that the house was clear and the boy was safe. But Raphael did not look away from her. He pressed his forehead to hers in the wreckage of his kitchen, and for the first time since grief had frozen him solid, the ruthless king of the city simply held on, as though she were the only warm thing left in a cold world, as though her softness were the one thing keeping him tethered to the earth. Castellano, the man who had sent his soldiers into that house, learned the price of underestimating a Moretti before the week was out. Raphael did not act in a blind rage. He let Nora spread the recovered ledgers across the kitchen table, and together, over cold coffee and the sleeping breath of the child down the hall, they traced every stolen cent, every forged manifest, every account through which Castellano and the disgraced Salvatore had bled the family. Nora's careful, patient mind mapped the whole rotten web, and when she was finished she looked up at Raphael with a quiet, steady certainty that made his breath catch. You do not need to burn his warehouses, she said softly. You need to take his money. A man like that rules through fear, and fear evaporates the moment his people realize the vault is empty. So they did it her way. Raphael's people froze what Nora exposed, drained the hidden accounts back into Moretti hands, and quietly delivered proof of Castellano's every betrayal to the rivals he had double-crossed and the authorities he had bribed. By the time the fog lifted, Castellano was bankrupt, cornered, and abandoned by the very men who had once feared him, undone not by a gun, but by the observations of a woman he had dismissed as a harmless nobody. Salvatore, who had smiled at his boss for a decade while plotting his death, was handed a fate the underworld considered worse than any quick end, stripped of everything, exposed to every enemy he had ever made, left to live out his days as a broken man whose own name had become a warning. And the great houses of the city, who had once laughed behind their hands at the Mafia king's clumsy, curvy Nanny, learned to speak of her with lowered voices and lowered eyes. Months later, snow fell soft over the city, dusting the iron gates of the Moretti estate in white. Inside, the great house that had once echoed with silence now rang with something it had not held in years: warmth. Mateo, who had not spoken a word in 2 long years, chattered endlessly now, trailing after Nora through the halls, tugging her toward the kitchen where she was teaching him to bake the lopsided cookies that had first made him laugh. And Nora herself was no longer hidden. She wore rich colors now, deep emeralds and warm burgundies tailored to celebrate the generous curves she had spent a lifetime apologizing for, and she moved through the fortress not as a ghost, but as its beating heart. She had stopped shrinking. She had learned, at last, to take up all the room she deserved. Raphael found her at the tall kitchen window, watching the snow, and he came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her soft waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "You are staring again, Mr. Moretti," she said, a smile in her voice. "I will never stop staring at you," he murmured against her hair. "I spent my whole life surrounded by people the world called beautiful, and every one of them was empty. Then you spilled milk on my floor and cracked my son open and terrified an entire ballroom just by being kind." He turned her gently in his arms, his dark eyes soft in a way the rest of the world would never see. "Do you know what you are? You are the one thing everyone overlooked, and I finally had the sense to keep." She looked up at the most dangerous man in the city, a man who bowed to no one and yet bowed, entirely, to her. And for the first time in her overlooked life, Nora Bennett believed she was exactly enough. She had been told she was too much and never enough, all at once, and she had proven the whole cruel world wrong. She was clumsy and curvy and kind, and she had won where every polished, perfect woman before her had failed, because she alone had ever offered him something real. If Nora and Raphael's story of unexpected love and hidden beauty warmed your heart, if you cheered when the clumsy Nanny outshone every supermodel in the room, then do us a small favor before you go. Smash that like button right now. Share this story with someone who believes that real love sees past the surface. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss another heartwarming, twist-filled tale of the underestimated soul who finally gets everything she deserves. And drop a comment below and tell us, what was your favorite moment in Nora and Raphael's story?